12 calls. That is how many times Caroline dialed her husband's number while she lay bleeding on the bathroom floor. 6 months pregnant with twins. 12 calls that went straight to voicemail because Derek was too busy with his mistress in a hotel room 40 minutes away, ordering champagne and laughing about the life he was building on lies. But what Derek did not know, what he could not have possibly anticipated, was that Caroline's father, a federal judge with 30 years on the bench and connections that ran deeper than any Whitmore fortune, would arrive at that house before the ambulance. And what Judge Harrison Montgomery found on his daughter's phone that night would set into motion a chain of events that would destroy everything Derek Whitmore had spent 7 years carefully constructing. This is not just a story of betrayal. This is a story of survival, of women who refused to be silenced, and of justice that came for a man who thought himself untouchable. If you believe that karma always finds its way, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very last satisfying moment of this story. Trust me, you will not want to miss what happens when a judge's daughter decides to fight back. The nursery smelled like fresh paint and hope. Carolyn Montgomery Whitmore stood in the doorway at 7 that evening, one hand resting on her swollen belly where 2 lives grew, twin girls. The ultrasound photos were pinned to a corkboard above the changing table, their tiny profiles facing each other as if already sharing secrets only sisters could understand. She had spent hours studying those images, memorizing the curve of each nose, the suggestion of fingers curled into fists. The room had taken 3 months to complete. Soft gray walls with white trim, 2 cribs positioned near the window where morning light would stream through sheer curtains, a rocking chair that had belonged to her mother, reupholstered in pale pink velvet. Caroline had done most of the work herself, painting late into the night while Derek attended yet another client dinner, another networking event, another excuse to be anywhere but home. She had spent this afternoon arranging stuffed animals on the white bookshelf, positioning them just so, a rabbit for one crib, a bear for the other. She had already named them in her mind. The rabbit would be Eleanor, after her grandmother. The bear would be Margaret, after no one in particular. She just liked the way the name sounded. Derek had promised to help hang the mobile 3 weeks ago. The promise had been renewed twice since then, but the mobile still sat in its box on the floor, a reminder of all the small disappointments that had accumulated over 7 years of marriage. His text had come 3 hours ago. Meeting running late. Don't wait up for dinner. She had typed back a simple reply, the same reply she always sent. When will you be home? The response took 40 minutes. 40 minutes during which she had checked her phone 11 times, telling herself she was being ridiculous, telling herself that busy husbands did not always have time to respond immediately. Not sure. Client emergency. Love you. 2 words of affection tacked onto the end like an afterthought, like something he remembered to include because that was what husbands were supposed to say. Caroline could not remember the last time those words had sounded genuine, could not remember the last time he had looked at her when he said them. She made herself soup from a can and ate it alone at the kitchen island, scrolling through Pinterest boards of nursery ideas she would never use because the nursery was already perfect, because she had done it herself. Like she did everything herself these days. The house felt too large when she was alone. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a formal dining room they had used exactly twice. Derek had insisted on buying it, had said it was an investment, had promised they would fill it with children and laughter and life. Now it just felt empty. By 9:30, exhaustion pulled her toward bed. The pregnancy books said rest was essential during the 3rd trimester, especially with twins. Her body was working overtime, growing 2 hearts, 2 brains, 2 sets of lungs. She needed to be kind to herself. She left the hallway light on for Derek, a habit from the early days of their marriage when she would stay up reading until she heard his key in the lock. Now she left the light on because she did not want to know what time he actually came home. The bedroom was cool and quiet. She changed into her softest nightgown, the one with the empire waist that accommodated her growing belly, and climbed under the covers. Her hand found its familiar place over her stomach, feeling for movement. There, a flutter, then another. "Hello, my loves," she whispered. "Mama's here." The cramping started at 10:47. At first, Caroline thought it was normal. The books mentioned Braxton Hicks contractions, practice contractions, nothing to worry about. Her body was preparing for the marathon of labor, rehearsing for the main event. But when she shifted position, something warm spread beneath her. She pulled back the covers slowly, telling herself it was nothing, telling herself she had simply sweated through her nightgown in her sleep. Red, the color of emergency, the color of everything going wrong. The scream that left her throat did not sound human. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap, primal and terrified. She scrambled backward away from the spreading stain, as if distance could make it disappear. Carolyn fumbled for her phone on the nightstand, fingers slick and shaking. The screen blurred through her tears. She pressed Derek's name. The contact photo showed him smiling, arms around her at their wedding reception. A different man, a different life. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Voicemail. Derek, please, I need you. Something's wrong. Please call me back. She called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. 40 minutes away. In the penthouse suite at the Ashford Grand Hotel. Derek Whitmore glanced at his phone and pressed decline. The woman beside him, Megan, traced a finger down his chest, her blonde hair spilling across the Egyptian cotton pillowcases. Who keeps calling at this hour, Mom? Nobody important. He silenced the device and tossed it onto the pile of his clothes. Probably the office. They can wait until morning. You work too hard, Megan smiled, reaching for the champagne bottle, sweating in its silver bucket. More, always. The cork popped with a sound like celebration. In their Boston townhouse, Carolyn made her 6th call. Her voice had grown desperate now, the words tumbling over each other. Derek, please, I'm bleeding. Something's wrong with the babies. Please answer. Please, please answer. Voicemail. She called again, and again, and again. By the 12th call, she was lying on the bathroom floor, having dragged herself from the bed in some instinctive search for help. The white towels were cold against her cheek. Pink water swirled in patterns around her. Derek, please. Her voice was barely a whisper now. Something's wrong. The babies. There's so much blood. Please, Derek. Please answer. I need you. I need you. The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered to the tile floor. She tried to reach it, but her arm felt heavy, disconnected from her body. The edges of her vision were going gray. This is how I die, she thought. Alone on a bathroom floor while my husband ignores my calls. She thought of her mother, dead 8 years now from cancer. Thought of the way her mother had held her hand at the end, had whispered that she was proud, that Caroline would be okay, that everything would be okay. Nothing was okay. Nothing would ever be okay again. But Caroline Montgomery Whitmore did not die that night, because at 11:15, Judge Harrison Montgomery pulled into his daughter's driveway. He had driven down from his home in Beacon Hill with a trunk full of antique children's books, a surprise for the granddaughters he already adored. His wife, Carolyn's mother, had collected the books over decades. Now they would pass to a new generation. When he saw the front door unlocked and the lights blazing at this hour, something primal seized his chest. 30 years as a federal judge had taught him to recognize when something was wrong. The air itself felt different, charged, dangerous. He found her on the bathroom floor. 30 years on the bench had shown Harrison Montgomery the worst of humanity. He had sentenced murderers and looked into the eyes of men who felt no remorse. He had heard testimony that would haunt him until his dying day. He had developed calluses on his soul, necessary armor for the work he did. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of his only daughter lying in a pool of her own blood. Phone clutched in her unconscious hand, face pale as death. Caroline, his voice echoed off the tile. Caroline, sweetheart, can you hear me? He called 911 with steady hands. 30 years of delivering verdicts had taught him to remain calm in crisis. His voice did not shake when he gave the address, when he described his daughter's condition, when he asked how long the ambulance would take. 7 minutes, an eternity. He applied pressure with every towel he could find, white cotton turning red under his hands. He spoke to her constantly, telling her about the books in his trunk, about her mother's garden when Caroline was small, about the summer they had spent at Cape Cod and she had learned to swim. You're going to be okay, he said, though he did not know if it was true. The babies are going to be okay. Just hold on, sweetheart. Help is coming. Your old dad is here. I'm not going anywhere. The paramedics arrived in exactly 7 minutes. They moved with practiced efficiency, loading Caroline onto a stretcher, calling out numbers and codes that Harrison did not understand. He watched them work, this team of strangers fighting for his daughter's life, and felt utterly helpless. As they lifted Caroline into the ambulance, Harrison turned back to the bathroom. He needed to lock up. He needed to follow them to the hospital. He needed to call Derek. That was when he saw her phone on the floor. The screen was cracked, but still illuminated. 12 outgoing calls to a contact labeled Derek with a heart emoji. Not a single one answered. Not a single one returned. And below those missed calls, a text message from an unsaved number that had arrived at 11:42. Baby, you left your watch on my nightstand. Come back soon. Signed M. Harrison Montgomery stared at those words as the ambulance doors closed outside. The siren wailed to life, fading as it carried his daughter toward the hospital. In his 30 years on the bench, he had learned to keep his emotions locked away. Justice required objectivity. Verdicts required evidence. Feelings were liabilities. But standing in his daughter's bloody bathroom, holding proof of her husband's betrayal, something ancient and terrible awakened in his chest, something that predated law and order, something that belonged to fathers protecting their daughters since the beginning of time. Derek Whitmore had no idea what he had just started. Harrison photographed the text message, the call log, the bloody bathroom floor. Evidence he was building a case already, without even realizing it. Then he locked the door and drove to the hospital. Hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, mind racing through possibilities and plans. This was not over. This was just beginning. The hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and grief. Harrison had been pacing for 2 hours, wearing a path in the linoleum. When Derek finally appeared through the emergency room doors, his son-in-law was slightly disheveled, hair damp, wearing a fresh shirt that still showed the creases from its packaging. The price tag, Harrison noticed, had been hastily removed but left a small white thread behind. Derek rushed toward the nurse's station with perfectly calibrated panic. Not too hysterical that would seem theatrical, not too calm that would seem cold. The exact right degree of concerned husband, as if he had practiced it in front of a mirror. My wife, Derek gasped, one hand pressed to his chest. Caroline Whitmore, I just got the message. My phone died, and the traffic was terrible coming from the office, and I didn't know until... Mr. Whitmore, Harrison stepped forward from the shadows. She's in surgery. While Derek turned, and Harrison watched surprise flicker across his handsome features before transforming to relief. The transformation took approximately 1.5 seconds. Harrison counted. Harrison, thank God you're here. Derek moved forward as if to embrace his father-in-law, then seemed to think better of it. What happened? Is she okay, the babies? Harrison studied his son-in-law with new eyes. The fresh shower smell beneath expensive cologne he had cleaned up before coming. The shirt purchased within the last hour. Tags hastily removed he had stopped to change. The wedding ring that had been absent from Derek's hand in recent photographs Caroline had shown him, but now sat prominently on his finger. He had remembered to put it back on. These were not the actions of a panicked husband. These were the actions of a man constructing an alibi. Your phone died, Harrison repeated, letting the words hang in the air. At what time? Around 9, I think. Maybe earlier. Derek ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of stress, but also a gesture that showed off how recently it had been washed. You know how these client dinners run long, and I didn't notice until I was in the car driving home, and then I saw all the messages, and She called you 12 times, Derek. Something passed through Derek's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. The micro-expression lasted less than a second, but Harrison had spent 30 years reading faces, 30 years watching witnesses lie on the stand, 30 years learning to see what people tried to hide. 12, Derek's voice cracked convincingly. I had no idea. Harrison, you have to believe me. If I had known, if I had any idea that something was wrong, I would have been here immediately. You know I love Caroline. You know I would never. The surgical doors opened, cutting off whatever lie was coming next. Dr. Robert Matthews emerged, still in his scrubs, his face carrying the weight of incomplete victories. Family of Caroline Whitmore. Derek stepped forward immediately, positioning himself as the primary family member. I'm her husband. How is she? How are my girls, doctor? Matthews glanced between the two men, perhaps sensing the tension, perhaps simply tired after hours of surgery. Your wife is stable. She lost a significant amount of blood, but we were able to stop the hemorrhaging. She'll need to remain in the ICU for monitoring, but her prognosis is good. And the babies, Derek asked. Our daughters, Dr. Matthews paused. The pause said everything. I'm sorry to tell you that we could not save both babies. One twin did not survive. The placenta partially detached. And despite our best efforts, he stopped. Professional detachment, cracking slightly. I'm very sorry. The surviving twin is stable, but will need careful monitoring. She's strong. She's fighting. The sound that left Derek's throat was extraordinary. He collapsed against the wall, shoulders heaving, face contorted in apparent agony. His fist pounded the plaster. His body shook with sobs. Nurses rushed to support him. A passing orderly brought water. Someone found him a chair. Harrison watched the performance without moving, because that was what it was, a performance. In 30 years of observing witnesses, Harrison had learned to read grief. Real grief was ugly and private. It did not announce itself. It did not check to see who was watching. Derek checked 3 times. Once when the nurses surrounded him, once when an attractive young doctor paused to observe, once when the elevator doors opened and an administrator stepped out. 3 times in 2 minutes. 3 calculations disguised as convulsions of sorrow. Harrison felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. Victoria Whitmore arrived within the hour, sweeping through the hospital like a general assuming command of a battlefield. Derek's mother had the preserved beauty of old money cheekbones that could cut glass, silver hair perfectly coiffed even at 2 in the morning, designer suit without a single wrinkle. She also had the sharp eyes of a woman who had eliminated every obstacle in her path for 6 decades. Harrison. Her voice was cool, pleasant on the surface, but with something harder beneath. Thank you for being here. We can handle things from here. My daughter is unconscious in the ICU. I'm not going anywhere. Victoria's smile did not reach her eyes. It never did. Of course, family should be together at times like these. She glanced at Derek, still sitting with his head in his hands. My poor boy. He's absolutely devastated. I'm sure he is. Something in Harrison's tone made Victoria look at him more carefully. But whatever she saw, she decided to ignore it. She had bigger concerns. Appearances to maintain, narratives to control. I'll speak with the administrators about getting Caroline a private suite, Victoria announced. The best care money can buy. Whatever she needs. The doctors here are excellent. I'm sure they are. But the Whitmore family has certain standards. She patted Harrison's arm, a gesture meant to be comforting, but that felt like condescension. You just focus on being a grandfather. Let us handle the rest. They allowed Derek into Caroline's room first. The privilege of the husband. Harrison watched through the glass as his son-in-law leaned over the bed, stroking Caroline's hair, pressing kisses to her forehead. The image of a devoted spouse, a loving partner. But when Derek thought no one was watching, Harrison saw him check his phone beneath the bed rail, saw him type a quick message, thumbs moving rapidly, saw the corner of his mouth lift in what might have been a smile before he composed his features and returned to his performance of grief. Harrison stepped back from the window, mind racing. The text message from M, the phone that had been silenced, not dead, the fresh shower, the new shirt, the lies. He pulled out his own phone and found the number for Marcus Webb, his oldest friend, his college roommate, now retired from the FBI after 30 years of service. Marcus, he typed, I need you to trace a number for me. It's urgent, personal. I'll explain when I can. The response came within 2 minutes, despite the hour, despite the years since they had spoken. Send it over. Whatever you need. Harrison photographed the text from the mysterious M and sent it. That night, while Derek gave tearful interviews to local reporters about the tragedy that had befallen his family, Harrison sat in the hospital chapel, not to pray he had stopped believing in God after his wife died, but to think. The chapel was small and dimly lit, with wooden pews and stained glass windows that looked gray in the darkness. A statue of Mary stood in one corner, her plaster face serene and sorrowful. Harrison sat in the back row and went over everything he knew. His daughter had nearly bled to death. One of his granddaughters was gone. His son-in-law had been unreachable during the emergency, had arrived freshly showered and wearing new clothes, and had received a text message from someone signing herself M. These were facts, Evidence, the foundation of any case. But what did they prove? Infidelity. Certainly, that seemed clear enough. But infidelity, while devastating, was not illegal. It was not actionable. It was simply Wapazahan. Harrison had the unsettling feeling that there was more, that the text message and the missed calls were merely the visible portion of something much larger. An iceberg, most of its mass hidden beneath the surface. He needed to know what else was down there. The next morning, while Caroline remained unconscious in the ICU, Marcus Webb called. Harrison, that number you sent me, it's not a personal phone. What do you mean? It's registered to a hotel, the Ashford Grand. It's their room service line. Someone used it to send a personal text, which means someone with access to that line, a guest or an employee. Exactly. I did some digging. The Ashford Grand is very exclusive. You need a certain level of membership or connection to even book there. And they have excellent security cameras in all their corridors. Harrison's grip tightened on his phone. Can you get access to those cameras? Not legally, not without a warrant, and you don't have enough for a warrant. Marcus paused. But I know people who know people. Give me a few days. If your son-in-law was at that hotel last night, I'll find proof. Harrison thanked his friend and ended the call. He stared out the window at the Boston skyline, at the city where he had spent his entire career pursuing justice. He had never expected to pursue it so close to home. 2 weeks after the tragedy, Caroline sat in her father's study surrounded by ghosts. The brownstone in Beacon Hill had been her childhood home, filled with memories of her mother's laugh and Sunday morning pancakes. Photographs lined the mantel her parents' wedding day, her own graduation from Harvard Law, her mother's garden in full summer bloom. Now the house felt like a sanctuary, though Caroline was not sure what she was hiding from. Perhaps from herself, from the woman who had trusted Derek, from the 7 years of willful blindness that were only now beginning to clear. She had been checking the ultrasound app on her phone every hour, watching her surviving daughter's heartbeat pulse across the screen. One life where there should have been two. The doctors said the remaining twin was strong, fighting, determined to live. Like her mother, they said, with encouraging smiles that did not quite reach their eyes. Caroline did not feel strong. She felt hollowed out, like someone had reached inside her chest and removed something essential. Sweetheart, her father stood in the doorway, holding a manila folder thick with papers. His face wore an expression she had never seen before. Not the composed mask of the courtroom, which she had grown up watching, which she had learned to emulate in her own legal career. This was something raw, something afraid. Dad, what's wrong? Harrison crossed to her chair and knelt beside it, taking her hands in his. His palms were warm and dry, the hands of a man who had held gavels and signed warrants and shaken hands with presidents. Now they trembled slightly. I need to show you something, he said. I prayed I was wrong, and I spent 2 weeks hoping I was wrong. I hired professionals to verify, hoping they would tell me I was seeing things that weren't there. You're scaring me. I know, I'm sorry. His voice cracked, and Caroline felt her heart crack with it. But you need to see this. You need to know the truth. He opened the folder. The first photograph showed Derek in a hotel corridor, his arm around a blonde woman in a red dress. They were laughing, faces turned toward each other, the body language of intimacy. The timestamp in the corner read 10:23, the night Caroline had nearly bled to death. The second photograph showed them entering a room together, room 1712. Derek's hand was on the small of the woman's back. Her head was tilted toward his shoulder. The third photograph showed the same woman's Instagram post, a champagne bottle in the foreground, crystal glasses catching light, city lights visible through a window behind. The caption read, "Secret romantic getaway with my love," heart emoji, champagne emoji, timestamp 11:45. The exact moment Caroline was being loaded into an ambulance. The exact moment her father was pressing towels against her, trying to stop the bleeding. The exact moment one of her daughters was dying. Her name is Megan Ashford, Harrison said quietly. She's 28 years old, junior analyst at Pemberton Associates, a competing investment firm. According to hotel records, they've been seeing each other regularly for almost a year, sometimes twice a week. Caroline's hands were shaking. The photographs blurred as tears filled her eyes. This doesn't... He said his phone died. He said. His phone was active until 1 in the morning. Caroline, I have the records. Harrison produced another document, a call log, printed on official letterhead. He declined your calls 12 times. He saw your name on his screen and chose to press decline while you were bleeding, while you were losing our granddaughter, while you were dying alone on a bathroom floor. Your husband was ordering champagne and laughing with his mistress. The folder grew heavier with each page Harrison turned. Credit card statements showing champagne purchases at $300 a bottle, hotel receipts spanning months, sometimes years, restaurant bills from places Carolyn had never been, places Derek said were for client entertainment, a timeline of lies so comprehensive it could have been a legal brief. Perhaps it was, Dad, Carolyn's voice came from somewhere far away, as if someone else was speaking through her mouth. Why are you showing me this now? Why did you wait 2 weeks? Harrison's eyes were wet. In 32 years of life, Caroline had never seen her father cry. Not when he sentenced men to life in prison. Not when her mother was diagnosed. Not even at the funeral, when he had stood like a statue as dirt hit the coffin. Because there's more, he said, and you needed to be strong enough to hear it. More what could possibly be more than this. Derek isn't just cheating on you, sweetheart. Harrison took a breath, steadying himself. He's been stealing from his clients for more than 2 years. And Megan Ashford isn't just his mistress. She's been helping him move the money through shell companies. They're partners, in multiple senses of the word. The words made no sense. They assembled themselves in Caroline's mind, but refused to form meaning. Derek was many things distant, distracted, increasingly cold, but a thief, a criminal. The man she had married, the man she had loved, the man whose children she carried. That's impossible. His family's company is hemorrhaging money that doesn't exist on paper. $4.2 million has been embezzled from client accounts over the past 26 months. Pension funds, retirement savings, money that elderly couples trusted Derek to protect and grow. Harrison spread more documents across the coffee table. Bank statements with highlighted transfers. Shell company registrations in Delaware, in the Caymans, in jurisdictions designed for hiding money, a web of fraud so intricate it must have taken years to construct. I had a forensic accountant examine everything, Harrison continued. A woman named Diana Sullivan, the best in Boston. She found the trail within 48 hours. Derek wasn't even trying to meet it. He assumed no one would ever look. Carolyn stared at the evidence. Numbers and names and dates that proved her husband was a stranger. Worse than a stranger, a predator in an expensive suit. I don't understand. Why would he need to steal? The Whitmores have money. Victoria's family has been wealthy for generations. That's what I wondered too. Harrison hesitated. Diana found something else. Derek has been making large cash withdrawals, $10,000 at a time, just under the reporting threshold. Regular as clockwork. Every 2 weeks for the past 18 months. What was he using the cash for? We're not certain yet, but the pattern suggests gambling, high-stakes poker games, the kind where you can lose $50,000 in a night. Gambling, fraud, infidelity. Each revelation worse than the last. Caroline felt like she was falling, even though she was sitting still. The room spun around her. The photographs on the mantel, her mother's smile, her wedding day, the life she thought she was building, all of it seemed to belong to someone else. There's something else you need to see. Harrison pulled out a final document, a life insurance policy, Caroline's name at the top, printed in coal black letters. Beneficiary Derek Whitmore. Amount $3 million. Date of purchase 8 months ago, 2 weeks before she got pregnant. He took out a policy on my life, Carolyn said slowly. Before I was even pregnant. Before you were pregnant. Before the twins. Before any complications that might put you at risk. Harrison's voice was steady now, the voice of a judge delivering evidence. The timing is very specific, Caroline. He increased the policy amount twice, once when you were 12 weeks pregnant, and again when the doctors confirmed twins. You think he was planning something. I think he was preparing for something. I don't know what. But Caroline, you need to understand, Harrison took her hands again, gripping them tightly. You're not safe, and you need to decide what you want to do about this. Caroline looked at her father. at the evidence spread before her, at the ruins of the life she thought she knew. She thought of the nights she had eaten dinner alone while Derek worked late, the weekends he had spent at conferences that she now realized were probably hotel rooms with Megan, the times he had said he loved her and she had believed him. She had been a fool. Worse than a fool, she had been willfully blind. The signs had been there for years. She had chosen not to see them. Something shifted in her chest. The grief was still there, a boulder pressing against her heart, and it would always be there. But beneath it, something else was growing, something hot and sharp and ancient, something that had been dormant her entire life, waiting for this moment to wake up. "I want to destroy him," she heard herself say. The voice did not sound like her own. It sounded like someone stronger, someone angrier, someone who had nothing left to lose. "I want to take everything he has. I want him to feel what I felt on that bathroom floor alone and afraid and abandoned." Harrison nodded slowly. His eyes held something like pride, something like recognition. "Then we need to be smart about this. We need to build a case that even Victoria Whitmore's money can't make disappear. We need a team." "What kind of team?" "The kind that can make sure Derek Whitmore spends the rest of his life in prison." He squeezed her hand. "And I know exactly where to start." The war room was established in Harrison's study 3 days later. Caroline watched from the leather armchair in the corner as 3 strangers arranged themselves around the mahogany table that had hosted Supreme Court justices and senators. Now it would host something different, a council of war. Diana Sullivan was small and precise, with steel gray hair, cut short, and glasses that she pushed up her nose when she was thinking. Her reputation as a forensic accountant preceded her. She had helped dismantle 2 Ponzi schemes and testified in a dozen federal fraud cases. Margaret Foster was her opposite, tall and striking, with the kind of presence that commanded courtrooms. She had built her career as a corporate attorney on destroying white-collar criminals who thought their wealth made them untouchable. And Marcus Webb, her father's oldest friend, sat quietly in the corner taking notes. His FBI connections ran deeper than anyone outside the bureau knew, and his eyes missed nothing. "Thank you all for coming," Harrison began. "I know this is unusual. I know I'm asking a great deal. You said this was personal." Diana Sullivan opened her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "You weren't exaggerating. I've been analyzing Whitmore Capital's financials for 48 hours straight. The fraud is extensive." "How extensive?" Caroline asked. 4.2 million confirmed. But I suspect that's just what I've found so far. Derek has been siphoning money through a network of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Caymans. Classic structure, but sloppy execution. Sloppy how? He left a trail, breadcrumbs everywhere. Diana pulled up a spreadsheet on her screen, turning the laptop so everyone could see. "These are wire transfers from client accounts to an entity called Ashford Holdings. Note the name. From there, the money moves through 3 more shells before landing in a personal account in the Caymans." "Oh, Ashford Holdings," Margaret Foster repeated, "as in Megan Ashford." "Exactly, my friend. She's listed as the registered agent for the Delaware entity. Her signature is on the incorporation documents." Diana shook her head. "If they were trying to hide their connection, they failed spectacularly." Harrison leaned forward. "But here's where it gets worse. Diana, show them the signatures." Diana pulled up another document, a wire transfer authorization form. Caroline's name was signed at the bottom in flowing cursive. "Those signatures authorizing several of the transfers, they're yours. Caroline." "That's impossible." Caroline's voice was sharp. "I never signed anything like that. I haven't been involved in Derek's business for years." "I know. They're forgeries. Good ones, whoever did them, studied your handwriting carefully. But forensic analysis will prove they're not genuine." Diana's face was grim. "He's been setting you up. If this ever came to light, you'd be the fall guy. He could claim you handled the accounts, that you made the transfers, that he knew nothing." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Derek had not just betrayed Caroline, he had tried to make her complicit in his crimes. If things went wrong, she would take the blame. She would go to prison. He would walk free. "That's not all," Marcus Webb said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet but carried weight. "When Harrison asked me to look into Derek's background, I found something the family has kept buried for years." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a police report, dated 3 years ago, and a photograph of a woman with tired eyes and a little boy on her hip. Rebecca Thornton, Marcus said. 3 years ago, she filed a police report accusing Derek of harassment, financial manipulation, and fraud. She claimed he had pursued her aggressively, promised to leave his wife, then turned threatening when she tried to end things. What happened to the report? Margaret Foster asked. Withdrawn 2 weeks later, Rebecca moved out of state within a month. My sources say Victoria Whitmore paid her $500,000 to disappear. Marcus tapped the photograph. Rebecca has a son. He's 5 years old now. DNA testing wasn't done at the time, but based on the timeline, Derek has a child, Carolyn said flatly. A son with another woman. That's what the evidence suggests. Carolyn looked at the photograph. The little boy had dark hair and a familiar chin. He looked like Derek. He looked like the children she had imagined raising with her husband. He looked like the brother her daughter would never know. He never told me, she whispered. 7 years of marriage, and he never once mentioned that's the pattern we're seeing. Marcus interrupted gently. Derek doesn't just betray women. He destroys them when they threaten his image. Rebecca tried to report him, and Victoria made her disappear. There's another woman too, Amanda Foster. No relation, he added, glancing at Margaret. Derek dated her about 6 years ago, before you met, when the relationship ended badly. Her identity was stolen. Someone opened credit cards in her name, took out loans, destroyed her credit score. She filed for bankruptcy 2 years later. And you think Derek did that? The timing is very suggestive. Amanda tried to warn you before the wedding. Caroline, she sent letters to your house. I never received any letters. I know. Someone intercepted them. Someone paid her landlord to evict her so she'd have to leave Boston before she could contact you directly. The pieces were falling into place. A picture was emerging, not of the charming, successful husband Caroline thought she knew, but of something much darker. A predator who used women and discarded them, who destroyed anyone who threatened his carefully constructed image, who had been doing this for years, protected by his mother's money and his own handsome face. There's one more thing, Diana said reluctantly. She pulled up a final document on her screen. This is the life insurance policy Harrison mentioned, but I found additional policies, 2 of them, actually, taken out on Caroline over the past 3 years. We knew about the $3 million policy, Harrison said. Yes, but there's another one for $2 million, and a third for 1.5. Different companies, different dates of purchase. Total coverage on Caroline's life, $6.5 million. Caroline felt the floor shift beneath her. He was going to kill me, she said. The words hung in the air, terrible and true. That's what the life insurance was for. That's why he increased the policies when I got pregnant. More risk, more coverage, more money when something went wrong. We can't prove intent, Margaret Foster said carefully, but the pattern is suggestive. Caroline's voice rose. He took out $6.5 million in life insurance on me. He was nowhere near me when I almost bled to death. He's been stealing money and setting me up to take the blame. She stood abruptly, pacing the room. What more do you need, a sign and confession? To build a criminal case that will survey Victoria Whitmore's lawyers, actually, Margaret's voice was calm but firm. We need more. We need witnesses. We need Derek's own words. We need evidence that proves not just what he did, but why he did it. Harrison stood and went to his daughter, placing his hands on her shoulders. This is why we're building a team, sweetheart. This is why we're being careful. We get one shot at this. If we move too soon, if we show our hand before we're ready, Victoria will bury us. Caroline closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. Her surviving daughter kicked inside her, a reminder that she was fighting for more than herself now. So what do we do? She asked finally. We gather more evidence. Diana said, we find Rebecca Thornton and convince her to talk. We find Amanda Foster. We find anyone else Derek has hurt, and we wait for him to make a mistake. And in the meantime, Harrison said gently, you go home, you play the grieving wife, you let Derek think he's safe. You want me to pretend everything is normal after everything you've just shown me. I want you to survive long enough to see him in prison. Harrison's voice was fierce now, the voice of a judge passing sentence. Can you do that? Can you look at the man who did this to you and smile? Carolyn thought of all the years she had already spent pretending. Pretending she didn't notice the late nights. Pretending she believed his excuses. Pretending their marriage was happy when happiness had left it long ago. She had been performing for years without even knowing it. I can do it, she said. Tell me what I need to do. 3 weeks of preparation. 3 weeks of smiling at Derek over breakfast while knowing he was a monster. 3 weeks of pretending to be the grieving wife recovering from tragedy while building a case that would destroy him. Carolyn had never known she could be such a convincing liar. Perhaps Derek had taught her. Through 7 years of watching his own lies. The restaurant was called the Hampshire Club, and it had been serving Boston's elite for over 100 years. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings. White-jacketed waiters moved silently between tables where old money dined on Dover sole and discussed stock portfolios. Carolyn had chosen it deliberately. Derek loved this place. Loved being seen here, loved the way the maitre d' remembered his name and his preferred table. He would be relaxed here, confident, off guard. She had spent 2 hours preparing, the navy dress that highlighted her pregnancy glow and made her look fragile. The pearl earrings that were a wedding gift from his mother, a subtle signal of loyalty. The soft makeup that made her look vulnerable, forgiving, eager to move forward. Everything was calculated. Every detail was a weapon. Derek arrived 10 minutes late, carrying white roses, her favorite, or what he thought was her favorite. She had mentioned once, 7 years ago, that she liked white flowers. He had apparently filed that information away and never updated it. In truth, she preferred peonies, but he had never bothered to learn the difference. You look beautiful, he said, kissing her cheek. His lips were warm and dry, and Carolyn had to fight the urge to recoil. How are you feeling? The doctor said the baby is doing well. Better, stronger every day. She smiled up at him, channeling every ounce of acting ability she possessed. The therapist says I'm making real progress. That's wonderful. He pulled out her chair with practiced gallantry, the perfect gentleman. I'm so glad you suggested dinner. I feel like we haven't really connected since everything happened. Because you've been too busy with your mistress and your shell companies and your $6.5 million in life insurance policies, Carolyn thought, but she reached for his hand instead. I wanted to talk to you about something, about us, about our future, about moving forward together. Derek's face arranged itself into an expression of concerned interest. Anything. You know I'll do whatever you need. My therapist suggested we consider a post-nuptial agreement. The words landed like stones in still water. Derek's hand stiffened almost imperceptibly under hers. His smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. A post-nup. I know it sounds strange, but Dr. Patterson says it can help rebuild trust after trauma, having clear expectations in writing, knowing exactly where we stand with each other. Caroline produced the document Margaret Foster had drafted, sliding it across the white tablecloth. It's mostly symbolic, about fidelity, transparency, that kind of thing. Derek took the papers, scanning them quickly. Too quickly. His eyes moved over the pages without truly reading, catching phrases like mutual respect and financial transparency and full disclosure, and assuming they were boilerplate, standard language. Nothing to worry about. He did not notice the clause on page 7, the one that granted Caroline full control of all marital assets upon discovery of any undisclosed financial irregularity, the one that would make his carefully constructed legal shields worthless. He did not notice the clause on page 12, the one that required complete disclosure of all accounts, domestic and foreign, within 30 days of signing, the one that would force him to reveal the shell companies or commit additional fraud. He did not notice any of the carefully crafted traps Margaret had built into the seemingly innocuous language. This seems reasonable, he said, reaching for his pen, a Mont Blanc, a gift from his mother, always ready to sign contracts and deals and whatever would make him richer. You don't want your lawyer to review it. Caroline? He looked at her with something resembling tenderness, or at least his best imitation of tenderness. I trust you. That's what this is about. Right? Rebuilding trust between us. He signed on the indicated line. Then the next. Then the next. Caroline watched his hand move across the page, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it. This was the moment. The first domino. Once he signed, the trap would be set, and there would be no escape. There, Busby. Derek capped his pen and smiled, sliding the document back to her. Now let's order. I'm starving. The filet here is exceptional. They ate. They talked. Derek told her about a difficult client who was asking too many questions about returns, a golf trip he was planning with some investors, a charity gala Victoria was organizing for the hospital. Carolyn nodded and smiled and made appropriate sounds of interest. Inside, she was counting the hours until his world collapsed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. She glanced at it under the table, keeping her expression neutral. SEC opens investigation tomorrow. Your timing is perfect. Everything okay? Derek asked, watching her face. Just the hospital confirming my appointment tomorrow. She tucked the phone away and reached for her water glass. Nothing important. That night, Derek walked her to her door. They had been sleeping in separate rooms since the hospital, at her request, and he had not argued. Perhaps he was relieved. Perhaps he was spending his nights with Megan instead of pretending to comfort his wife. I'm so glad we're moving past this, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. We're going to be such good parents. Caroline, this baby is going to have everything. Caroline smiled up at him. I know we will. She watched him walk down the hallway to his room, whistling softly, a man without a care in the world, a man who thought he had won. Tomorrow, federal investigators would arrive at Whitmore Capital. They would arrive with warrants and questions and the power to freeze accounts and seize records. They would find enough evidence to begin unraveling everything Derek had built, and Derek had just signed away his only protection without reading a single page. For the first time since that terrible night on the bathroom floor, Caroline slept without nightmares. The SEC investigators arrived at Whitmore Capital at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. By noon, Victoria Whitmore was at Judge Harrison Montgomery's door. Caroline watched from the upstairs window of her father's brownstone as a black town car pulled up to the curb. Victoria emerged in a charcoal Chanel suit, her silver hair perfect, her expression unreadable. She moved up the front steps with the confidence of a woman who had never been denied anything in her life. Caroline's father opened the door, his face carefully neutral. Victoria swept inside without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk, Caroline heard Victoria say, her voice carrying up the stairs. Privately. Now. Harrison led her to his study. Caroline crept down the stairs, pressing herself against the wall outside the closed door. She knew she should not eavesdrop, but she also knew that whatever was happening in that room would determine everything. Victoria's voice came through clearly, decades of country club elocution making every word crisp and sharp. Harrison, let's not pretend. We both know you're behind this SEC investigation. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult my intelligence. I've known you for 15 years. Your FBI friend Marcus Webb has been asking questions all over Boston. Your forensic accountant Diana Sullivan accessed banking records she had no legal right to access. And yesterday, my son came home with a signed postnuptial agreement that reads like a confession extraction device. Victoria's laugh was cold. You've been building a case against my son, using your own daughter as bait. A long silence. Carolyn pressed closer to the door. What do you want, Victoria? I want you to stop. Call off your dogs. Make this SEC investigation disappear. I have enough friends at the commission to slow it down, but I need you to stop feeding them information. Victoria's heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she paced. In return, I won't destroy everything you have built. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact. Papers rustled. Victoria had brought documents of her own. Do you remember the Morrison case 15 years ago? The defendant who hanged himself in his cell 3 days before sentencing. Another long pause. When Harrison spoke again, his voice was different. Careful. What about it? I know about Marcus Webb. I know about the evidence that was manufactured to secure the conviction. I know that the defendant might actually have been innocent. And I know that you knew. Harrison, you knew and you said nothing. Carolyn felt the blood drain from her face. Her father had always been her hero, the incorruptible judge, the guardian of justice. This couldn't be true. You can't prove any of that. Can't I? Victoria's voice was silk over steel. I have sworn statements from people who were there, photographs of evidence that was planted. Recordings that Marcus Webb made and thought he'd destroyed. A soft laugh. Did you really think the Whitmore family survived 4 generations in this city? Without learning how to protect ourselves, we have eels on everyone, Harrison. Everyone who might someday be useful or dangerous. Silence stretched. Carolyn counted her heartbeats, 20, 30, 40. What exactly are you proposing? You step back, quietly. Let the SEC investigation run its natural course. But stop feeding it. Stop helping Caroline build her case. Stop using your connections against my family. Victoria's voice softened slightly. And in return, this folder stays in my safe. Your career remains intact. Your precious reputation survives. Everyone wins. And if I refuse, then I burn it all down. All pretense of civility vanished. Your 30-year career ends in disgrace. Your legacy becomes a cautionary tale about judicial corruption. Your daughter, your pregnant daughter, becomes known as the child of a criminal. And make no mistake, Harrison, I will ensure everyone knows that Caroline was complicit in her husband's business dealings. I have documents that prove it. Those are forgeries. The truth is whatever I decide it is, that's what money buys. Harrison, you should know that by now. You've watched it happen in your courtroom 100 times. Footsteps moved toward the door. Carolyn fled up the stairs, heart pounding, tears streaming down her face. She collapsed on her bed, hands pressed against her stomach where her daughter kicked and rolled, oblivious to the chaos outside the womb. Her father, her hero, her rock. Her last remaining ally had a secret, a terrible secret that Victoria Whitmore could use to destroy them both. That evening, her father called her into his study. His face was gray, his eyes haunted. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Sweetheart, I have to step back. What, Dad? No. Caroline grabbed his hands. We're so close. The SEC is investigating. Derek signed the post-nup. Everything is falling into place. I know, but I can't. His voice broke. I can't be part of this anymore. You need to trust me that it's to protect you. If I stay involved, they'll destroy us both. Dad, please, I need you. I can't do this alone. But he was already turning away, and Caroline recognized the set of his shoulders, the same look he wore when he sentenced men to prison, the look of someone who had made a terrible choice and would not be moved from it. I'm sorry, he said without turning around. I'm so sorry. That night, alone in her childhood room surrounded by photographs of happier times, Caroline allowed herself to cry. The team was dissolved. Diana and Margaret would continue their work, but without Harrison's connections, without Marcus Webb's FBI resources, the case would move slowly if it moved at all. Her father was silenced. Derek's lawyers were circling. She was utterly alone. Then she found the note. It was tucked under her pillow. In her father's precise handwriting, the same handwriting she had seen on birthday cards and permission slips and notes of encouragement throughout her life. I cannot fight beside you anymore, but everything you need is in the safety deposit box at First National. Key taped under my desk. The code is your mother's birthday. I love you. I'm sorry. Win this for both of us. Carolyn read the words 3 times, tears blurring the ink. Her father had not abandoned her. He had given her weapons. He had equipped her for a war she would have to fight alone. Now she just had to find the courage to use them. The safety deposit box contained everything. Caroline spread the contents across her bed like a general reviewing battle plans. Contact lists with names and phone numbers annotated in her father's handwriting. Evidence files organized by date and source. Bank statements and wire transfer records and corporate registrations. Detailed notes analyzing every weakness in Derek's carefully constructed empire. And a single name circled 3 times in red ink, Detective Sarah Bennett, Boston SVU. She made the call that afternoon, her voice steadier than she felt. Mrs. Whitmore. Detective Bennett's voice was careful, professional, with an undercurrent of something that might have been anticipation. I've been expecting to hear from you. You have. Your father reached out to me before he stepped back. He told me about your situation, about what Derek has done. A pause, Jacqueline. I investigated your husband 3 years ago. Rebecca Thornton's case. What happened? Victoria Whitmore happened. Suddenly, my witnesses couldn't remember anything. Evidence went missing from the file room. My captain strongly suggested I focus on other cases. Bitterness crept into her voice. But I kept my notes. I kept everything. I always knew Derek would do it again. Men like him always do. They met at a coffee shop in South Boston, far from the Beacon Hill Society crowd, far from anyone who might recognize Caroline and report back to Victoria. Detective Bennett was younger than Caroline expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and the coiled energy of someone who had been waiting years for permission to strike. "I've been building a shadow file since the Rebecca Thornton case," the detective said, spreading papers across the small table between them. Every complaint against Derek that went nowhere. Every witness who suddenly changed their story. Every pattern that pointed to something bigger. "Why didn't you pursue it officially?" "Because officially, there was nothing to pursue, Tsuon. Witnesses recanted, evidence disappeared, and the Whitmore name carries a lot of weight in this city." Sarah Bennett's jaw tightened. "But you're different. You're not some woman Derek picked up at a bar and discarded. You're a federal judge's daughter. You're a Harvard-educated lawyer. You're someone people will believe. What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me find the other victims. I need them to talk. And I need to build a case so strong that not even Victoria Whitmore's money can make it disappear." Rebecca Thornton agreed to meet at a playground in Brookline. Her son, Noah, was playing on the swings when Caroline arrived. Derek's son, the half-brother her daughter would never know. He had dark hair and a familiar chin, and when he laughed, Caroline could hear echoes of her husband's voice. "I told myself I'd never speak about this again," Rebecca said quietly, watching her son pump his legs higher and higher. "Victoria made it very clear what would happen if I did. She said she would destroy me. She said she would take Noah away." What changed? Rebecca's eyes never left her son. "He asked about his father last week. First time ever. He saw other kids at school with their dads and wanted to know where his was." Her voice hardened. "I didn't know what to tell him. I'm tired of lying, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm tired of being afraid. And I'm tired of watching my son grow up thinking his father doesn't exist. I'm so sorry for what he did to you. Don't be sorry, but be angry." Rebecca finally turned to face her. "And when you take him down, make sure he knows it was all of us. Make sure he knows he couldn't erase us." Amanda Foster joined via video call from her mother's basement in Ohio. She had lost her apartment, her career, her credit, everything, to Derek's revenge campaign after she ended their engagement 6 years ago. "I tried to warn you," Amanda said, her face pixelated but her bitterness clear. "Before your wedding, I sent 3 letters to your house explaining everything. I drove to Boston twice trying to see you in person. I never received any letters. I never knew you existed. I know. Someone intercepted them, and someone paid my landlord to evict me the week before your wedding so I'd have to leave the city." Amanda's laugh was hollow. "I lost everything because I tried to do the right thing, because I tried to warn a stranger that she was marrying a monster. I'm sorry, Buo. Don't be sorry, Mokim. Make him pay." The fourth witness surprised everyone. Megan Ashford reached out to Caroline directly, through a private message on social media. "I know who you are. I know what Derek did to you. I have recordings of everything. I want to help." They met in a hotel conference room, neutral territory, both of them nervous. Megan was younger than Caroline expected, beautiful in a fragile way, with dark circles under her eyes and fingernails bitten to the quick. "He told me you were abusive," Megan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you trapped him in a loveless marriage. That you got pregnant on purpose to keep him. That the baby probably wasn't even his." Ooh, she shook her head. "I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. I thought I was rescuing him from a terrible situation. I thought he loved me. What changed? I found out about Rebecca, then Amanda. Then I started paying attention to the way he talked about you, about all women, recording things on my phone just in case." Megan pulled out her device with shaking hands. "I have over 40 hours of Derek talking about his schemes, laughing about the people whose money he stole, bragging about how he fooled everyone, including you." She pressed play. Derek's voice filled the conference room, smooth and arrogant and dripping with contempt. "You think I married Caroline for love, please? Her father is a federal judge. I needed protection. I needed access. Once I have enough money put away in accounts no one can touch, I'll get rid of her and start fresh. Maybe with you. Maybe with someone else. Does it matter? Caroline listened to her husband discuss her like she was furniture, like she was a stepping stone, like 7 years of marriage and 2 pregnancies meant nothing at all. Something inside her crystallized. The last thread of doubt, severed. The last hope for reconciliation, dead. Thank you, she told Megan, for coming forward, for being brave. I'm not brave. Megan wiped her eyes. I'm angry. I thought I was special. I thought I was the one he really loved. Turns out I was just another victim. 4 women, 4 victims, 1 predator. Caroline looked at the evidence spread before her, the financial documents, the recordings, the pattern of destruction spanning years. She thought of her surviving daughter, growing stronger every day, of the daughter she had lost, of all the women Derek had hurt and would continue to hurt if no one stopped him. She was not fighting for revenge anymore. She was fighting for every woman Derek Whitmore had ever destroyed. And she was going to win. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in patience and preparation. Caroline's apartment became a command center. The dining room table buried under documents, the walls covered with timelines and connection maps. Detective Bennett came by every evening with updates from her unofficial investigation. Margaret Foster handled the legal strategy, finding the ways to use the posted nuptial agreement Derek had so carelessly signed. And Nathan Brooks, the former Whitmore Capital accountant who had been fired for asking too many questions, delivered the final piece of the puzzle. He arrived on a Thursday evening, looking over his shoulder the entire walk from his car to Caroline's building. A nervous man in his 40s, with thinning hair and worried eyes. I kept backups of everything, he said, handing over a flash drive. 13 months of actual financial records. The books Derek showed auditors were fiction cleaned-up versions that hid the transfers. These are the real numbers. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Because Victoria promised to destroy my career if I talked. She said she would make sure I never worked in finance again. She said she would tell people I was a thief, that I was the one stealing. He met Caroline's eyes. I have a wife. I have a daughter. She's 4 years old. I couldn't risk their future. What changed? Nathan looked down at his hands. When I heard what Derek did to you the night you almost died, the baby you lost, I thought about my daughter, about what kind of father I want to be, about what I would want someone to do if she was ever in your position. The evidence was overwhelming now. Financial fraud documented in Nathan's files. Pattern evidence from Rebecca and Amanda. Intent evidence from Megan's recordings. A case so airtight that even Victoria Whitmore's money might not be able to buy an escape. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Elizabeth Warren, who had built her career on taking down wealthy criminals who thought themselves untouchable. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, reviewing the assembled files in Caroline's apartment, you've done our job for us. The forensic accounting alone would justify charges. The recordings prove intent. The pattern of victims establishes a history of predatory behavior. She smiled grimly. This is going to be a landmark case. When can you move? We need to coordinate with the SEC to freeze accounts simultaneously. We need to ensure Victoria can't move assets offshore. Another week, maybe 2. Elizabeth leaned forward. We want to arrest Derek and his mother at the same time, in public, with witnesses, something undeniable. Carolyn knew exactly where that would be. Whitmore Capital's annual shareholder meeting was scheduled for Friday of the following week. Every major investor would be present, board members, media representatives, Victoria herself, presiding over the event. She considered her personal triumph. It would be perfect. The night before the meeting, Carolyn was reviewing documents one final time when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Dr. Catherine Pierce from Mass General. We need to discuss your husband's recent records request. Caroline's blood went cold. What request? He asked for your complete prenatal file, medical history, appointment schedule, emergency contacts, home address. A pause. Given recent events, I thought you should know. Hospital policy requires spousal disclosure in some circumstances, but his request seemed unusual. Unusual how? He specifically asked about high-risk indicators, Potential complications. What might cause an emergency? The doctor's voice was careful. Mrs. Whitmore, is there anything you'd like to tell me? Caroline thanked her and ended the call. Her hands were shaking. Derek knew something was wrong. He was gathering information, preparing for something. She had thought she was the hunter, but perhaps she was also the prey. The Whitmore Capital boardroom gleamed with mahogany and money, 20 floors above the Boston streets, behind walls of glass that showed the harbor glittering in morning light. 24 shareholders had gathered for the annual meeting. They sat in leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, reviewing glossy reports that promised another year of impressive returns, returns built on stolen money, returns that did not exist. Carolyn watched from across the street, standing in the shadow of an office building. As the shareholders arrived, designer suits and expensive watches, the confidence of people who had never been denied anything. Derek stood at the entrance greeting arrivals, flashing his perfect smile, shaking hands with the easy charm that had fooled so many people for so long. Victoria presided inside, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, every silver hair in place. The queen of an empire built on fraud. They had no idea what was coming. Carolyn crossed the street at exactly 10:30, flanked by Detective Bennett and 2 FBI agents in dark suits. Behind them came Elizabeth Warren and her prosecution team, carrying boxes of evidence. And behind them, walking together for the first time, came Rebecca Thornton, Amanda Foster, Megan Ashford, and Nathan Brooks. 4 victims, 1 insider, and a federal judge's daughter with nothing left to lose. The receptionist in the lobby tried to stop them. "Ma'am, this is a private meeting. You can't just—" "We have warrants." Elizabeth Warren produced the documents. Federal warrants authorizing the seizure of records and the arrest of Derek Whitmore and Victoria Whitmore. "Please step aside." The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt like an eternity. Caroline's heart pounded against her ribs. Her daughter kicked inside, restless, as if she could sense her mother's anticipation. This was the moment every thought changed. The boardroom doors opened. 24 faces turned toward the entrance. Derek's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and something that looked almost like recognition. Like he had always known this day would come. "Caroline," his voice was carefully controlled, but she could see the calculation behind his eyes. "What's going on? You're supposed to be resting." "I'm done resting." She moved to the front of the room, aware of every eye upon her. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Caroline Montgomery Whitmore. Most of you know me as Derek's wife. What you don't know is that the man you trusted with your money has been stealing from you for years." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Shareholders exchanged glances. Victoria rose from her chair at the head of the table. "This is outrageous. Caroline, you're clearly unwell. The trauma of losing the baby has affected your judgment. Someone please escort her." "I'm perfectly well, Victoria. In fact, I've never been clearer." Carolyn nodded to Elizabeth Warren. "Federal Prosecutor Warren, if you would—" The next 45 minutes were systematic destruction. Financial records appeared on the projection screen. Shell company registrations, wire transfers, forged signatures. Nathan Brooks walked the shareholders through each document, explaining in precise accountant's terms how their retirement savings had been funneled through fake companies into Derek's personal accounts. $4.2 million, Nathan said, advancing to the next slide. Stolen from clients who trusted this firm, stolen from pension funds, stolen from elderly couples who gave Derek Whitmore their life savings. Derek's face had gone pale. "This is fabricated. My wife is mentally unstable. She's been suffering from delusions since—" "Would you like to explain these wire transfers, Mr. Whitmore?" Elizabeth Warren interrupted, pulling up another document. "These are your signatures, your authorization codes, your fingerprints on the accounts. I was framed, someone at the company. By whom? Your own employees, your own mother." The prosecutor's voice was ice. "We have witnesses. Mr. Whitmore, we have recordings." Megan's recordings played next, Derek's voice filling the boardroom, dripping with contempt for everyone he had robbed. "Those old people are so easy. They just hand over their savings and had trust me to make them rich. And when the money disappears, they'll blame the market, or the economy, or their own bad luck. They'll never know I took every penny." One by one, shareholders pushed back from the table. Board members distanced themselves. Allies became strangers. The room was silent except for Derek's voice on the recording, laughing about how stupid everyone was. We also have testimony from victims of Mr. Whitmore's pattern of predatory behavior. Elizabeth Warren continued. Rebecca Thornton, please. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. I met Derek Whitmore 4 years ago. He pursued me aggressively, promised to leave his wife, promised we would build a life together. When I became pregnant, he threatened to destroy me if I didn't disappear. Amanda Foster. Amanda's video testimony played on the screen. Derek Whitmore stole my identity after I ended our engagement. He destroyed my credit. He cost me my job, my apartment, my future. I tried to warn his wife before their wedding, and someone made sure my letters never arrived. Megan Ashford. Megan stood, tears streaming down her face. I thought I was special. I thought Derek loved me. He told me his wife was abusive, that she had trapped him. Everything he said was a lie. Everything. Derek watched his world collapse with something approaching disbelief. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, his charm had failed him. This is a conspiracy, he finally managed. My wife and her father are trying to destroy me because your wife's father has no involvement in this investigation. Elizabeth Warren cut in. Judge Montgomery recused himself weeks ago. This case was built by federal prosecutors, SEC investigators, and the brave witnesses you see before you. Victoria Whitmore made one last attempt to save her son. She stood, smoothing her Chanel jacket, composing her features into an expression of maternal concern. Surely we can discuss this privately. Whatever misunderstandings have occurred, Mrs. Whitmore, Detective Bennett stepped forward. We also have evidence regarding your involvement in obstructing previous investigations into your son's behavior. Oh, Megan spoke up again. Victoria Whitmore paid me $200,000 to disappear 2 months ago. She told me exactly what to say if anyone asked about Derek. She explained how she had covered up Rebecca's complaint 3 years ago. She pulled out her phone. I recorded every conversation. I have wire transfer receipts. I have everything. The color drained from Victoria's face. You can't prove we have the bank records. We have your voice on tape explaining how you paid off witnesses, how you made evidence disappear from police files, how you've been protecting your son for years. Elizabeth Warren nodded to the FBI agents. Victoria Whitmore, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Derek lunged toward Caroline as the agents moved in, his face contorted with rage. All pretense of charm abandoned. You vindictive bitch, I gave you everything, you were nothing before me. Nothing. A boring lawyer with the famous father, and I made you somebody. 2 agents restrained him. Caroline did not flinch. You gave me nothing, Derek. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had found her power. Everything I am, I built myself. You just took credit. You took my trust, my love, my faith in you, and you used it to hurt me and everyone around you. You'll regret this. My lawyers will destroy you. My mother's friends will. Your mother is being arrested alongside you. Your lawyers work for a firm that's about to be investigated for its role in hiding your crimes. And your friends. Carolyn glanced around the boardroom at the shareholders who refused to meet Derek's eyes. I don't see anyone here willing to defend you. She stepped closer, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead. But here's what you did give me, Derek, the strength to make sure you never hurt anyone again. The determination to protect our daughter from ever knowing what kind of man her father really is. She turned to the FBI agents. Officers, I believe you have work to do. They led him away in handcuffs, Victoria following moments later. Cameras flashed as reporters who had been tipped off flooded the corridor. Shareholders sat in stunned silence, watching their investments evaporate alongside the Whitmore reputation. Carolyn walked out of the boardroom on steady legs, in the hallway, leaning against the wall with tears streaming down his face. Her father was waiting. He had come despite everything, despite Victoria's threats, despite the risk to his career. Your mother would be so proud, Harrison whispered, pulling her into his arms. You didn't just win. Sweetheart, you did it the right way. She tried to use you against me. She failed because I raised my daughter to be stronger than that. He held her tighter. I'm sorry I couldn't fight beside you. I'm sorry I had to step back. You gave me everything I needed. You trusted me to do the rest. Outside the building, Rebecca Thornton held her son up to watch the police cars departing. See that lady, baby, she said, pointing at Caroline. She's why we're free, now. 6 months later, Caroline stood at the edge of a small grave in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Autumn had painted the trees in shades of gold and amber. Fallen leaves crunched beneath her feet as she walked the familiar path to the headstone she had visited 100 times. The marker was simple, white marble, elegantly carved. Baby Montgomery Whitmore, beloved before she was born, forever in our hearts. Lily squirmed in Caroline's arms. 6 weeks old now and already showing her mother's stubborn spirit. She had dark hair and curious eyes and a cry that could wake the neighbors 3 houses away. She was perfect. I brought your sister to meet you, Caroline said quietly, kneeling beside the grave. I know you would have loved each other. I know you would have been best friends. The sentencing had happened 3 weeks ago. Derek received 12 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Victoria received 5 years for obstruction of justice and witness tampering. Neither showed remorse at their hearings. Derek blamed everyone but himself. Victoria maintained her innocence until the very end. Carolyn had watched from the gallery, feeling the weight of justice finally delivered. But there was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, just the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had fought too long and lost too much. There were other feelings too, though, ones that had grown slowly over the months. The Montgomery Alliance for Financial Justice had launched 2 weeks after the trial. Already, dozens of victims had come forward, not just Derek's victims, but people all over the country who had been defrauded by charming men in expensive suits. People who had been silenced by money and power. People who finally had somewhere to turn. Rebecca Thornton was working for the foundation now, managing victim outreach. Her son Noah called Harrison Grandpa and spent weekends at the Beacon Hill brownstone, learning to play chess and eating too many cookies. The family Derek had tried to erase was becoming part of Caroline's own. Amanda Foster had moved back to Boston with the help of foundation funds. She was rebuilding her credit, rebuilding her life. She sent Caroline a card every month, just a note of thanks, a reminder that fighting back had mattered. Megan Ashford had moved to California for a fresh start. She sent photos, sometimes a new apartment with good light, a dog she had adopted, a community college enrollment form, a life that was finally her own. Nathan Brooks had found a new position at an ethical investment firm, one that valued integrity over returns. His daughter was starting kindergarten in the fall. He had written Caroline a thank you letter that she kept in her desk drawer. And Harrison Montgomery, the judge who had sacrificed so much to give his daughter the tools to fight, had been quietly cleared by the Judicial Review Board. Victoria's evidence had been investigated and found to be fabricated, one final lie from a woman who had built her entire life on lies. There is something that happens to women who survive betrayal. Not all of them, not every time, but some women, when they pass through the fire, emerge transformed. Not harder, exactly, but clearer, more certain of their own worth, more determined to protect others from the flames they escaped. Carolyn had learned this over the past 6 months, had watched it happen in Rebecca and Amanda and Megan, had felt it happen in herself. The woman who had called Derek 12 times, begging for help, was gone now. Buried alongside the daughter she had lost, in her place stood someone new. Someone who knew that real power was not about money or connections or the charming lies men tell. Real power was about truth, about courage, about refusing to be silent when silence was easier. Carolyn touched the headstone gently, feeling the cool marble beneath her fingers. I couldn't save you both, she whispered. But because of you, I saved so many others. Your sister will know your name. She'll know your story. And she'll know that you made me brave enough to fight. Lily stirred in her arms, one tiny hand grasping at her mother's collar. Carolyn stood, adjusting the blanket around her daughter's face, shielding her from the autumn wind. Tomorrow there would be more victims to help, more battles to fight, more work to do. But tonight, Caroline Montgomery held her daughter close and whispered the words her own mother had told her. years ago, before cancer stole her away. We survive, sweetheart. That's what the women in our family do. We survive. And then we help others survive too. The sun was setting over Boston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The wind carried the sound of church bells from somewhere in the distance, and a mother and daughter walked out of the cemetery together, leaving one grave behind, but carrying its memory forward. The end was just another beginning.